This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Welcome to the Marvel Age Masterclass podcast with host Ben Morse. Episode 7, 1966, Part 1, with Russell Sellers.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to yet another edition of Marvel Age Masterclass. My name is Ben Morse. I'm thrilled to be here with you on this beautiful, warm evening in Las Vegas, Nevada, the entertainment capital of the world, to share with you more knowledge and more opinion on the state of Marvel Comics from years and years ago. In this case, we're going to be talking about 1966. A seminal year for the Marvel Universe. We're going to discuss two major titles, and we're going to have a lot of fun. If you haven't already, go and listen to Marvel Age, the flagship podcast, 1966 Part 1, where the Sarcastic Four discuss the same topics we will be covering tonight in some depth. It's a great listen. I recommend it. It's a wonderful show, and I am fortunate to have my first return guest here on Marvel Age Masterclass, one of the Sarcastic Four, a man who has some big plans for the fall and beyond that we'll talk about later, and that is Russell Sellers.
I'm back to get a few more kicks out of 1966.
Oh boy.
Yes, that pun's never going to get old to me. So if everybody's just okay with that, then strap in. I'm going to keep making it until you all get sick of it and turn the show off.
So we've got at least 4 episodes where you're going to drop that little bomb.
At least, and I am going to do it until they cancel us.
Yeah, and who knows if number one, we can't be canceled.
Yes, exactly. So
it's my understanding.
So I operate. So what you're saying is I operate with impunity.
Exactly.
I like it.
You are a maverick with no one to reel you in. Yeah, I'd say keep it going well into 1967 when things really start getting freaky.
Oh.
So, Russell, we first talked, I was looking at my phone, we talked back in May about 1961-62 Marvel. You were my very first guest on Marvel Age Masterclass. Before we dive into 1966, I want to ask you, how is the experience in general going? Because I know you have to share the stage with 3 other guys on the other show. But here, let's talk a little bit about Russell. Let's see where he's at. And how are you enjoying the Marvel Age experience thus far, getting to read some for the first time of this mixed bag of classic comics?
It has been an eye-opening experience for me. As most people know who've been listening to Marvel Age, this really is my first time reading a lot of this stuff, especially where Fantastic Four, Avengers, and even those old Uncanny X-Men, or just the adjectiveless X-Men, as it were. All of that's very new to me. The only thing that's really not is Amazing Spider-Man. That is the book that I know probably better than any other. So a lot of this has been, very eye-opening for me. Not terribly surprising in some other cases, because I was, as you well know, I have not been that big a fan of Fantastic Four. And the early goings here with Stan and Jack hasn't really done much for me. But some things may have changed recently. Yeah. And I think that's a way to segue into our first topic.
Yeah, and you, I believe, cursed my name on the most recent edition of Marvel Age.
I curse your name daily, Ben.
Yes, that is a perfect segue to talking about the first family of the Marvel Universe. Of course, the fabulous Fantastic Four. Now, we've got 4 big stories to cover tonight, a quartet of giants. This is some really big stuff going on. To give you guys a little context, a little background, as we always like to do, The thing that was happening in Fantastic Four in 1966 was, I think the most important thing was Jack Kirby had scaled back on his other assignments. And you really start to see that here. He was pretty much, I believe, down to Fantastic Four and Journey into Mystery / Thor. Possibly Sergeant Fury. I think he held on that one for a little while. But as far as Avengers and X-Men go, he was scaling down. And the solo titles, he was leaving to other artists. So we really got to see Jack kind of focus in and make this primary thing. Stan is still writing everything. He is still spread very thin. But you get to see Kirby kind of at the height of his powers on these issues. And I think the design aesthetics, particularly in the first story we're going to talk about, really start to show that this is in some ways becoming a more visual book. But in other ways, I think when Kirby starts throwing his best pitches, you start to see a little bit of healthy competition between him and Stan. Who can come up with the bigger ideas? Who can top who? And we'll get into that in a sec. But what did you feel like? I mean, you've got 5 years of Kirby under your belt at this point, doing a range of different things. Some good, some bad, some indifferent. What did you think of Kirby's output on Fantastic Four for 1966?
Personally, I thought it was some of his best work ever. This is where, as you were saying, that he had spread himself so thin over the course of these first 5 years that we've been talking about, that it was suffering. You could notice it in certain titles that he was just not committing fully to them. He was just trying to hurry up and get the pages done. Mm-hmm. And then there were other times where he would be doing layouts and letting another artist come in to finish it off. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in 1966 Part 2, where he does that very thing on certain other titles that are not going to be mentioned here. But whenever he's fully committed to doing just like 1 or 2 books per month, that's when it really starts to shine. And in these stories in particular, I think this is the best looking work that Kirby has done at Marvel yet. Particularly that Galactus saga. Mm-hmm. That really hit with me. Yeah. His Silver Surfer design in particular was it's so simple and elegant, but it is perfection in character design.
I want to jump back for a sec. We'll get to Galactus and Silver Surfer in a second, of course. But we ended 1965 with the kind of quiet, ironically, given their lead character, introduction of the Inhumans. And in 1966, we get the full Monty as far as the Inhumans are concerned. We get Black Bolt in all his majesty. We get Karnak. We get Crystal. We get Maximus. We get Lockjaw Gorgon. We already had Medusa. We get to see inside Attilan. We get to see a lot of the Inhuman mythology that Kirby and Lee had come up with really blow up. Now, what I want to say about the Inhumans, and I talked about them a little bit with Nick last episode, is they've always been kind of Marvel also-rans, if you know what I mean. Like they're not the X-Men. They feel in some ways like kind of a retread of mutants. Like we already have this whole race of mutants. Why do we need this separate race of Inhumans? To me, what's interesting about the Inhumans that I don't think was touched on in Marvel Age, maybe a little bit, but what really is interesting to me about the Inhumans is they are in some ways the Fantastic Four explored in a bigger realm. If you'll indulge me for a moment, it's the idea of that superpowered family done on a grander scale. I'm not saying it was a hit, but I see what Lee, and I think in particular Kirby, was trying to go for with these guys. I think you'll see it in Kirby's work a lot, whether we go back to it with the Eternals, with the New Gods. He's obsessed with this idea of creating this hidden race that has some sort of greater destiny locked in. And of course, a lot of the later Inhuman stories would unlock some of that stuff, the Kree aspect to it. None of that's here. They're just basically a race of weirdos. but he really loves that whole hidden city dynamic, that idea of they're a cut above normal humanity. And I would say whereas the X-Men was solidly, you had mutants solidly integrated into society, the difference with the Inhumans are they're really their own thing. They're off and they're separate. And like I said, it's the idea of this superpowered family, but not just the nuclear family. It's the idea of cousins and uncles and nephews and all of this huge extended family done. And then you bring in the royal aspect, the kind of Game of Thrones before it was around, a couple decades. And it's interesting. Now, I'm not going to disagree with you guys. I don't think that's a lot of me basically taking 40, 50 years of Inhumans and saying, now through the few good stories that have been done with them, we get it. Like when the humans really sing, they really sing. But here, I think they're more of a cool visual. I think Black Bolt, in my opinion, has one of the best costumes of all time. I think Karnak's a good design. I think Gorgon's a good design. I even think Medusa and Crystal are good designs. I think, again, this was Kirby working out the kinks of an idea he would return to again and again. So you almost see the Inhumans as being a first draft of something he would kind of perfect with the New Gods in particular. But yeah, I think there's a lot to the Inhumans. I just don't know. We said with some of the other stories, like it took a while and it took the right creators to get them right. I don't know if the Inhumans have ever reached their full potential. I think there's something there. I just don't think the closest I would say is Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee did a great take on them for Marvel Knights. But I don't know. What do you think, Russell?
I didn't really talk much about Inhumans on Marvel Age because
well, you have the floor, sir.
I gotta say that this is gonna be an exclusive. I disagreed with Nick's assessment of this particular story. The back half of it is actually where I finally got interested.
There we go. All right.
And it was because of characterizations. It was because of how they interacted with each other, and the introduction of the negative zone, which was something I always wondered, like, where exactly did this idea come from? It's something that's used throughout Marvel Comics, and seeing it introduced here and how it was done, I was like, okay, well, this is cool. This has got my attention. I'm actually getting emotionally invested in the relationship of Crystal and Johnny Storm, even though in the back of my mind I'm thinking, you have known this girl less than 24 hours, and you are like this level of like crazy smitten. And
Johnny Storm falls hard
and fast. And Sue Storm, voice of reason, calls him out on it just before she gets upset about people not noticing her new hairdo. So one step forward, two steps back. But all of that aside, I actually got a little invested in the back and forth of the Inhumans. You're right to. I think the Game of Thrones comparison is apropos in that one of the guys who is I'm struggling with like character names now, but especially for Inhumans because I'm never going to remember them all. But it was the Black Bolt's brother.
Maximus.
Maximus has one of his loyal subjects, the one who was out to capture veritable dragon, as I like to refer to him, Dragon Man anyway. He is a relatively inconsequential character, but when he comes back and finds his loyalties challenged, you see like actual like internal conflict with him. So I kind of gravitated to that and thought, okay, well this is an interesting aspect of this story. This is something that is going to keep me like invested in it. But just as soon as we're really getting into the meat of that, it's over and we move on to something else.
It's true. I think that was the interesting thing about Fantastic Four at the time, is like they were just throwing so many big ideas out there. And the thing that's coolest to me, the Fantastic Four at their best is when they are expanding the Marvel Universe. That's why I love this initial Lee Kirby 100-issue run so much, because every story has something new. Like you're getting the Inhumans, and then you're immediately afterwards transitioning into Silver Surfer and Galactus. Before we leave Inhumans, I'll just say quickly that I heard it talked about a lot when I was at Marvel. That I threw the Game of Thrones reference in because a lot of people would call Game of Thrones like Inhumans done right in some ways, which was interesting, and because they don't have, obviously, Game of Thrones. Well, I guess they have their own versions of superpowers, and they don't have like this hidden race or anything like that. But just this idea that you do royalty and you do kind of like the palace intrigue and all these shifting loyalties and all these people trying to get at one another. They thought that was what Inhumans should have been, just done big. And again, I'll point to, I think in many ways, the Fourth World stuff, the New God stuff in particular, is Kirby doing Inhumans on a bigger level. He almost, learned from the stuff that was weak, but then accentuated the stuff that worked. I think Black Bolt has always worked, and you see a lot of his qualities transferred over to other characters.
Sure.
I think the Johnny Crystal relationship that you touched on, it always worked. It's Romeo and Juliet. It's the star-crossed young lovers who just can't get it together. So there were things that worked, and I think Kirby was committed to making the Inhumans work. So you guys are going to see in the next few years a lot more of the Inhumans, and I think Stan gets in on it as well. But to me, and this is strictly my interpretation, what I referred to at the beginning when I said it almost became a game of one-upsmanship, I really feel like Kirby threw the Inhumans out there, and then Stan said, I can top that, and then gave Kirby the biggest story he ever had to draw. He's basically like, I can top that with an idea, and then I'm going to challenge you, Jack, to rise up to the level of this idea. And that, of course, as we know, is the infamous pitch for the Galactus story, which was, and you guys referred to it on Marvel Age, the Fantastic Four fight God.
Yep.
It's supposed to be God coming down from the heavens, an angry God. And how can the Fantastic Four oppose this creature who is literally omnipotent? We'd seen the exploration of great power in Doctor Strange with characters like Eternity, with characters like Dormammu, but this was different for Fantastic Four. This was a character that they could not. The Thing was not going to punch Galactus out, and that to me was interesting. Stan established with this story a riddle for Jack and himself to solve, which is how do the Fantastic Four, how does humanity resist the all-being, the greatest threat they have ever faced? And what I like about this story, and I want to hear all the stuff that kind of won you over with it, Russell, but what I love about this story, I think in the best, is that they need to think their way out of it. They need to discover some sort of weakness. This is a chance for Reed to shine, but he's super overmatched. I love the stuff with Reed growing the beard and getting all haggard. I love, Johnny furiously trying to find the ultimate nullifier. I love Thing punching out with the Punisher robot because that's all he can do. Alicia Masters, her great stuff with the Silver Surfer, which I know you guys had mixed feelings about, but I dig it. Just so much good stuff, but really just the idea that the Fantastic Four are more than just a punch and kick fight team. This is not the Justice League just using all their powers at the same time and turning away the threat of a huge villain. This is, it felt like the stakes were higher, Yep. It felt like the stakes couldn't get any higher. And I don't know if have you read Marvels?
I have not, but that is one that very much interests me, especially after this.
This is, I mean, there's never going to be a better version of it than the Lee Kirby stuff. Although I like that you guys referenced the 90s FF cartoon because they did a really good job of adapting it.
Legit, yes, did.
They did. They really did.
Even though that show largely was terrible.
The thing about that show is it was largely terrible, but they did some like really faithful adaptations of classic stories.
Sure.
And when they just literally animated, like the original Galactus saga and didn't change anything, yeah, of course it was good.
Yeah,
but
all the Silver Surfer stuff was excellent.
Yeah, but I would say definitely it's worth your time to check out Marvels. It's a great series, period. It's still, to me, some of Alex Ross's best work, even years later. But the Galactus stuff is just incredible. It's when you see it painted and you see this story done in a realistic style and seen from the everyman perspective, it's just amazing. It's mind-boggling. But again, the thing about this, the stakes, the characterization, which you were talking about with the Inhumans, and just getting to see our heroes put into such a place of peril and ultimately get their biggest win, which I think really gave the Fantastic Four some credibility as well. You have 50 issues of these guys overcoming the odds, but this is the biggest thing they've ever had to face, and we do see them come out on top in the end.
And it's presented just beautifully by that Kirby art. I mean, he's done well with these giant character spreads up to now, and that's kind of what we've seen a lot of in Fantastic Four. But for me, what I love seeing him do is all of this like deep space cosmic stuff where it really does feel like this is what the inside of his mind looks like. This is him unleashed, and he's getting to create like just the craziest looking stuff you can possibly come up with. And if Stan was throwing him curveballs to try and mess with him, I'd say he was pretty well knocking those out of the park.
Let me just jump in quick. I just because I want to clarify my point.
Yeah.
I don't think he was throwing him curveballs to try to mess with him. Like, I don't think it was I think it was a very friendly competition.
Sure.
I think he was trying to set him up to be the best he could. I think they both were. I think they were challenging each other, and I think that's where they got their best stuff. I don't think Sam was trying to like sandbag Kirby or something, trying to throw him off his game. I think he wanted the best out of him.
Well, sure, not exactly what I meant. I meant that he was just trying to, like, in the game of one-upsmanship, like giving him a challenge to see if he'd really rise to it.
That's fair. Your baseball analogy was solid. I should have left it alone.
And it's working out really well. Some of the deep space stuff just, my God, it's mind-boggling. It just has to be seen to be believed. So everybody needs to go read those issues.
Absolutely. If you've never read the Galactus trilogy and you only get to read one Fantastic Four story, this is the one I would sell people on. I mean, I was waiting for you to get to it because you were so resistant to Fantastic Four. I was like, if the Galactus story doesn't get him, then nothing will.
Galactus story is legit. It is the one in all of Fantastic Four that we've read up to now. And even a little bit of the stuff, including the stuff we've read after this, that I would say is like, this is cream of the crop. This has got to be like Stan and Jack at the height of their power, creating something that is unlike anything you've seen in superhero comics, anything in comics up to this point, I would think, because as was pointed out, they were challenged by a hungry god. And in all honesty, they don't really win.
True.
I mean, you don't really get a story where the heroes just come out on top at the end of this. They merely delay what may be the inevitable.
That's a great way of putting it.
So you've got this like really complex story where they've tried to negotiate with this godlike being who is not, in fact, really a villain. Galactus just is. He is an entity who is out there to ensure, like most other entities, ensure his own survival. So he's got to eat, and this is his next meal. That's a very like tantalizing a meal that could satiate him for who knows how long, but it could be a good long while considering how rich Earth seems to be to him. But of course, you've got Uatu the Watcher. Does more than watch, which is,
as always.
He can't help himself. And then you have the emotional journey of the Silver Surfer, where he turns on his master and doesn't exactly have his powers taken away at the end, but he's just no longer able to fly through space, which I think takes away a lot of the interesting aspects of the Surfer. But neither here nor there, because it's just an interesting dichotomy that we see explored between the science of Reed Richards versus the science or the I don't want to call it magic or mysticism, but you've got something that defies all scientific explanation in Galactus.
Mm-hmm.
And here's Reed trying to understand it, trying to find a way to combat it, and all it's doing is driving him insane.
Yeah, it nearly drives him nuts.
So we see that obsessive side of Reed Richards. I got it a little bit more this time, but I still stand by it. Reed Richards is the biggest asshole in the Marvel Universe.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. I mean, he gets a nice hero moment here, but no, that doesn't excuse him from being just a total dick. And we're going to talk more about Reed Richards as asshole before this episode is over. I want to touch quickly on the characters you just mentioned that we've been talking about. First of all, Galactus. An amazing creation. Visually spectacular. Something you guys touched on is that the cool thing about Galactus is Kirby and him, he essentially created a design that's impossible to mess up. Unless it's the big screen and,
well,
that whole thing.
Well,
but,
and they kept changing his colors on his costume.
Right. They kept tweaking.
But I love there was a kind of a low-key explanation for it in that he can be whatever he wants to be.
Right. And however we perceive him is how we perceive him. That's not how he looks to everybody.
It's like he is literally, the Gozer of the Marvel Universe. He's whatever he wants to be.
Yeah. So. To me, the best Galactus is the Galactus we get here, who he'll talk to the Silver Surfer, but he's not really going to deign to speak to Reed Richards.
No.
Reed is so beneath him. We've seen every kind of Galactus story over the years. We've seen chatty Galactus, which I'm not a fan of. To me, Galactus just comes, goes about his business, and this is like, it's not that he has, like you said, he's not a villain. There's no malice to what he does. He doesn't hate humanity. He just doesn't even acknowledge humanity. Humanity is so beneath him. It's the same way when we're walking across a park. We don't think about the ants we're stepping on. Galactus doesn't consider humanity to be anything but ants. And for someone like Reed Richards, who sees himself as being so important, this is just another thing. You talked about the technology driving him nuts. I think the fact that he doesn't get acknowledged by Galactus makes him crazy as well. And this
yes.
I think it makes Galactus a different kind of threat. And I say threat instead of villain because I think the fact that he won't engage in banter with the heroes really sets him apart and is a key part of his character to me.
It's the question of, do humans consider the bees whenever we're trying to take their honey away?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Exactly, no.
It's like we don't try to communicate with them. We can be stung by them, we can be harmed by them, but it would take a lot of them to kill us.
Exactly. Ultimately, in the end, we're going to win.
Yeah, it's like you have to be deterred away from it by something, by some outside force on your level.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what the Surfer and the Watcher are really meant to be in this particular case. I think the only thing that could have made Galactus' exit better is if he would have looked back whenever they asked if he was ever coming back and said, the only thing that's for sure about Galactus is nothing's for sure.
And then goes back to the rafters.
Yep. Just like rappels up to the rafters and changes his colors all to like black and white and
pretty badass.
Looks down like all depressingly menacing and pissed off for about 6 months, and then he finally comes back.
Black and white Crow Galactus would be the true ultimate Galactus. So yeah, we talked about the Surfer turning on him. Basically, this like you said, this odyssey the Surfer goes on where he rediscovers his own humanity by touching humanity in the form of meeting Alicia Masters, getting to know these humans, and thinking, oh my god, okay, they're worth battling for. So here's where I'm gonna jump ahead a little, Russell,
Okay.
to kind of challenge you, but also, as a good teacher would, kind of put things into perspective. So you feel that taking away the Surfer's ability to travel the spaceways is going to limit him as a character.
Yeah.
Here's what's interesting about what you've got coming up in terms of the really good Silver Surfer stories. And there are a few good ones in Fantastic Four before he gets his own solo series. But once he gets his own solo series, because Stan has said Silver Surfer is probably his favorite character. And he says he's the one he most enjoys writing, with the Shakespearean soliloquies and really droning on and on. And you can tell he becomes, as much as he was a Kirby creation, and you acknowledged the beautiful simplicity of his visual appearance, he is very much a writer's character moving forward. And we get to I don't want to spoil too much of the great Silver Surfer solo book that Stan and John Buscema did. John Buscema is one of my favorite artists of all time and does incredible work with the Surfer. But part of what makes the Surfer so interesting in these initial stories, and I'm not saying his cosmic stories are bad, because I think eventually they told all the stories to tell with him on Earth, and he had to go to the next level of him exploring space, discovering new worlds, doing all that. But in this initial run, what's interesting is he just basically threw everything away for humanity. He basically took everything that was good about his existence, being able to travel the spaceways, the safety of traveling the Galactus, all this incredible power, and basically the freedom that he enjoyed. He said, humanity is worth my sacrifice. And what you find in the stories where Surfer is trapped on Earth is he begins to see whether or not he made the right decision. And I'm kind of teasing it out because I don't want to fully spoil it for you. But there's something very cool about seeing the Surfer being forced to kind of suffer through the decision he made, and interacting with humanity and seeing he saw the best of humanity. You're going to get to see him experience the worst of humanity. And there's something very cool about it. And there's something that it's something you can only do with a Surfer who's trapped, who cannot escape, who cannot go back out into space where he can just be happy. He can't, once they eventually loop in his home world, he can't go back there. He made his bed by choosing Earth, and now he's got to lie in it. And it makes for some really dynamic storytelling.
I'll say that I will probably be very interested to see. But of course, whenever it comes to my cosmic characters, I like them being cosmic. So I'm probably going to be one of those that bounces back and forth. Like, I'll find things to like about his time on Earth, and then I'll be like, all right, let's get back out there to the stars and have him like surfing around to all these like crazy locales, because I'm really interested to explore the cosmic side of Marvel, because it's one of those things where every time I've kind of toyed with it or like ventured into it here and there, I've always really liked what I got out of it. And it's kind of the same deal. It's not exactly the same deal over at DC, because I find myself a lot of times there, if I'm doing cosmic stuff, I'm not necessarily really enjoying myself all that much, unless we're talking Green Lantern, and in which time, yes, I've very rarely found anything that I just outright hated there.
Yeah.
But Marvel feels different. Marvel feels like I've got the Nova Corps, I've got Guardians of the Galaxy, I've got all the stuff dealing with Galactus and the Silver Surfer. Those type things are always just interesting to me for some reason.
I would argue that Marvel Cosmic, it comes into being in it has spikes. It's interesting. It's not as consistent as DC, because you don't have that one perennial title, which for DC is Green Lantern, that will always be set at least partially in space. With Marvel, Silver Surfer would kind of come and go as far as being a solo title. And then you see a lot of other books like Captain Marvel, like Warlock, pick up in the 70s and kind of have their day. But then the 80s is kind of a turn back, with the exception of stuff going on in X-Men, to the more grounded Earth level stuff. And I guess accepting Secret Wars. Then in the 90s, you get all the Infinity stuff, Infinity Gauntlet and its sequels. And then again, in the early 2000s, it's all about cycles. Marvel Cosmic goes in cycles. And this last cycle began with Annihilation, which was a concentrated push to put Marvel Cosmic back on the board. And this has been the one that's really stuck, because Annihilation introduced the Guardians as we know them now. It brought Silver Surfer and Nova back to prominence, and it's really just we've ridden since then. And you know, if Brian Bendis hadn't decided he wanted to write Guardians, if the Guardians hadn't been a successful movie, I don't know if Marvel Cosmic would have lasted as nicely as it's done now. And it's arguably at its most successful now. But getting back to the Silver Surfer and actually comparing him to Green Lantern, because that's DC's premier cosmic character, and I think Surfer at the end of the day is probably Marvel's premier solo cosmic character. And I think the difference between them, obviously, is Hal Jordan's human. And seeing him explore foreign planets is him exploring the unknown. And I'll just leave you with this to say that the equivalent of that for Norrin Rad is him being stuck on Earth, because that to him is an alien planet. And again, you're going to get plenty of great cosmic Surfer stuff in the future. I think eventually, honestly, they do run out of stories to tell with him on Earth, but those first few years, there's a lot of good to mine in.
Okay. I'm looking forward to giving it a shot.
We will talk about it in the future. Let's talk more about Fantastic Four in this installment, though. And what's next is again, the game of one-upsmanship continues as Stan and Jack collaborate on one of the most, as you guys found on Marvel Age, one of the most divisive Fantastic Four stories of all time. And that's This Man, This Monster, in which the Thing is restored to Ben Grimm by a villain who wants to take his body and end Reed Richards, and instead ends up experiencing the life of a hero and ultimately making a sacrifice that saves Richards' life, that restores Ben Grimm to the Thing. It's a one-and-done story. It's not going to be surprising. I fall on the side of loving it. I think it's incredible characterization. I think what you guys, or half of you guys, saw as a weakness in the kind of villain who comes out of nowhere, to me, there was strength in that. That Stan and Jack could make you care so much about this character in one story and really give him a full redemptive arc. I think, again, this might not be them challenging each other. This is them challenging themselves.
Yeah.
Can we take, over the course of a couple dozen pages, this cipher of a character and fully bring him from villain to hero and just tell this epic story in the course of one issue? I think it's a challenge that, once again, they rise to the occasion on.
Well, I agree. You know that I was one that actually really, really loved this issue.
I paid close attention to you in particular on this episode of Marvel Age, because I knew I would have you on as a guest.
Yep.
And I was on the edge of my seat when we got to This Man, This Monster, because I knew some of you guys didn't like it. And I was like, please don't let Russell fall on the Capel side.
No, I did.
Tim didn't like it either, right? I'm assuming.
No, Tim
doesn't like most things that are good.
Tim Infinity Ward this one.
That's what I thought.
I think he would Thanos snap it out of existence if he could.
Oh my god!
But no, I was very much in favor of this one surviving the Thanos snap. By God, because this was Ben Grimm's sad sack shining moment. Because his walk through the rain and seeing him dealing with all this, like, just heavy, weighty, emotional stuff from the last couple of Fantastic Four adventures, it really hit with me. I was like, I get it, Ben. This is all just one big, glorious misunderstanding. between he and his girlfriend. But since he and Alicia just don't ever really talk, this is where he is. And you're right about the villain. I found him more compelling than I expected to, especially for a villain who's just introduced in this one issue, comes out of nowhere. But he has huge history with Reed Richards. Normally I would not write that a pass. I would call that out as bad storytelling. But they did it in such a way that I actually started to get emotionally invested in where that was going. It also helped from my own writer sensibilities and preferences that this issue is also a follow-up to what we saw in the Galactus saga. We see Reed Richards trying to prepare for the next Galactus level threat. He is now thinking ahead. He's so worried about what may or may not happen that it's become all-encompassing for him.
It's legitimate character development.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yes, it is driving him forward. And we get to see that through the eyes of someone who hates him. And as a result, it's probably why I started to come to like Reed a little bit more in this issue. And if my buddy on Twitter, Frank, is listening, Mike, if you're listening to this, buddy, don't you dare call me out on my one moment here where I liked Reed Richards. He's still a dick. This is not the time. I am not turning to a Reed Richards fan, but I am going to say that in this one instance, you get to see some good qualities of Reed Richards, of him forward thinking, but also him making stupid mistakes and somebody having to come behind him and clean up.
Yep, absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head that the cool thing about Fantastic Four as a serial form of storytelling is that Galactus really had an impact on all the characters. There is like a clear delineation of the Fantastic Four before they met Galactus and after they met Galactus. He is always looming over them. And you see in a lot of the follow-up stories, whether it's Reed trying to prep or the fallout of what happens to the Surfer, or eventually what other characters who weren't in the initial Galactus story start getting a whiff of what's going on with Galactus. It's a line-altering event. It changes everything for FF, and as a result, changes everything for the Marvel Universe. Because FF, as we've said many times, at this point is the center of the Marvel Universe. It's the flagship title, and what happens in FF kind of extends out to all other places. So you do start to see other characters eventually get a little more cosmic. The threats get bigger, the stakes get higher, and things just continue to escalate. But it's cool that we can scale back for a second, do an issue like This Man, This Monster. We had this huge trilogy where the opposition was incredibly huge, and here it's just a guy. It's just a guy with an idea. But he can still put the Fantastic Four into peril. And the other thing I want to touch on quickly is, I don't know if I've mentioned this on this podcast before or not. I really need to start, keeping track of what I say. But one thing that was interesting to me when I was talking to Tom Brevoort, who is, of course, the keeper of all things Fantastic Four at Marvel, edited the book for longer than any other editor in history, including Stan. He always used to tell me that, to put it into context, was Wolverine was at one point the most popular character in Marvel and in comics, and he was everywhere, and everyone loved him. He said that the Thing was Wolverine before Wolverine was Wolverine. The Thing was the single most popular Marvel character. He was the breakout star of Fantastic Four, but he was also the breakout star of the Marvel Universe. And you're seeing here, with the solo story and with kind of the focus on him, Stan and Jack really lean into that. And the idea that Ben Grimm was legitimately and remains one of the most compelling figures in all of Marvel. And of course, he's been eclipsed by some other characters in terms of popularity, But I'd argue at the heart of the Marvel Universe, there might not be a more nuanced and three-dimensional character than Ben Grimm. And I'll take it back again to Jonathan Hickman's Secret War. To me, Ben Grimm is the heart of that story. And he's the heart of the Marvel Universe.
Hard to argue with that. I mean, it makes sense to me that he would be from the 1960s. He seems like that kind of character. And
right.
I can say you could argue I think there's still a case for Wolverine still being the most popular Marvel character today.
Yeah, possibly.
I don't think he's out of the conversation, but
No.
But Ben Grimm very much I could see that, like I would think that in the 1960s he and Spider-Man would have been battling it out for that spot.
Yeah, pretty much neck and neck. Yeah.
And yeah, I could get on board with that. Ben Grimm has been he has certainly become my favorite part of reading these Fantastic Four issues. So yeah, I buy that.
So the last, we move on from This Man, This Monster, which is great. Tim Capel's insane.
But we love him.
That's why we love him, right?
I don't want to change anything about Tim. I like him as he is.
Am I going to have a 5-hour podcast with Tim about This Man, This Monster?
You're going to have a 5-hour podcast with any one of us at some point.
At some point, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
That's the true trial by fire. Speaking of trials by fire, the Fantastic Four undergo one in their final story of 1966, or the last one we'll be talking about on this episode. And that is, it's crazy to think within a few months, you got the Inhumans, which, granted, may, in modern context, not feel as important. I almost would say the Inhumans have been watered down by the last few years of overexposure. But in 1966, the introduction of the Inhumans was a big deal. The introduction of Galactus and Silver Surfer was a huge deal. And then to follow that up, to have the very next multi-issue story, they're going to introduce something else. And it shows that Stan and Jack, just because they had kind of, as you said, reached the height of their powers, they didn't slow down. Because we get the introduction of Wakanda, and with it, the Black Panther, who is, of course, just over the last 12 months, probably reached his peak as a pop culture figure.
Yep.
And I would argue that this is probably, in the Marvel Universe and maybe in the DC Universe, there are some other instances where it's true, but Wakanda may be the most important. You can see me like hesitating to make the hot take, but I think it might be the most important location introduced in comics. Just because I think the idea of this hidden land, I mean, the Savage Land is up there. Over at DC, I don't know if there's anything comparable. Maybe like the Fortress of Solitude, but that doesn't feel as big. I'm thinking of like Scartaris, where Warlord hangs out. It's definitely not on the same level as Wakanda.
That's not even on the same level as Savage Land.
Yeah, right? I just think Wakanda was such a cool idea. And it was a progressive idea. Because you have to understand, this was 1966. This was not an era of racial equality. Stuff was happening. And, particularly the youth of this era was starting to get there. But to come up with this idea that there was a black hero on the same level as the Fantastic Four. And I know you guys took the first issue to task for the fact that Black Panther basically, systematically takes out the Fantastic Four, and it's a little hackneyed. Yeah. And some of the execution is not the best. But I think there was something necessary about establishing the Black Panther right out the gate to an audience that was still predominantly white, to get them to accept this character. And it may have resulted in them, to use wrestling terminology, over pushing him from the start.
Yeah.
But once you get into his story and his background, which again, I think it's hilarious, as you guys said, that the Thing is like, come on, get on with it already.
Yep.
Because he's so loquacious, but just the idea of the Panther being such a great character. Just like he's as smart as Reed almost. He's a better fighter. He's a king, which gives him that aspect. And then just the coolness of Wakanda as being this hidden land that no one can mess with. And that's something that's kind of been established over the years. We saw it in the movie. We saw it a lot in the last few years of Black Panther comics. But just this idea of Wakanda as being this unstoppable place where the people are so fiercely proud and so ingrained in protecting their home that it can't be threatened. And when it is threatened, that's a huge deal. So you've got the twin introductions of Black Panther and Wakanda, a lot of stuff going on. Just the fact that, again, this is the first major solo black superhero to be introduced, essentially. And it's Stan and Jack, kind of being, again, ahead of the curve in doing so. So there are flaws in his introduction, but I think when all is said and done, it's a tremendous addition to the Marvel Universe.
Well, sure. I mean, he's an iconic character, and more so than just the character himself, as you pointed out. Wakanda, we also get the first appearance of Ulysses S. Claw, and a bit of background there on him in that second issue of the Black Panther and Wakanda introduction. And that's really where Black Panther comes into his own and starts to shine. But he starts to shine so early, and it's like, as much as we took that first issue to task, the second issue was like a stark turnaround. And
right.
Was like, okay, he's maybe not the fully formed version of Black Panther that we all know and love from the recent films, and certainly from his current comic iterations, but he's not that far off. He's going to get there, and you can see the building blocks of it in this early story. If I remember right, was Vibranium also introduced in this?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
We get Vibranium right off the bat.
Yeah, we're getting all of that introduced right here. So you're getting huge characters and concepts introduced in these first two issues. And while that first one is just, well, it starts off well enough, it just kind of devolves into a really ho-hum way of doing this. And I actually would have found it far more interesting if they would have just had a conversation about what was about to happen.
Right.
And then you get the big fight in the next issue, which you still get the big fight, and it's really cool. So this is, it's Kirby being brought back down to Earth, but he still gets to draw some really cool, big ideas and really play with this new land that's so much more technologically advanced than anyone ever would have guessed. So it's a pretty great little two-parter and a nice little dessert, I guess, for the end of this Fantastic Four meal.
Yeah, it's perfect. And again, it's worth noting that this is what Lee and Kirby did as a follow-up to Galactus. Like, they didn't just do...
They did not rest on their laurels. They
did not rest on their laurels. They did not easily say... They had introduced so many characters in the first 50 issues, they could have easily just said, let's relax and do another Puppet Master story.
Please don't.
Let's bring back the Mole Man.
Please don't.
I'm just going to keep throwing them at you. But instead, they say, no, let's keep creating stuff. Let's keep this hot streak alive, and let's introduce a whole new locale, a whole new hero, and a whole new dynamic to what we've already got. And it's additive. And the Marvel Universe continues to expand, even as these guys have passed 50 issues on Fantastic Four. They're still going, and there's still a lot of good stuff yet to come. And
I'm looking forward to diving in further. I'm not sure if all of it is really going to be able to meet the expectations I now have thanks to Galactus and the second part of the Black Panther story, but you know what? I'm going in with a much more open mind now than I was before.
I look forward to seeing how you receive the next few years of Fantastic Four, because I do think once Lee and Kirby hit a hot streak, they tend to ride it out. But we'll let you be the judge, Russell.
Okay.
And, we'll have you back on, and we'll see what you think. And I look forward to hearing on each episode of Marvel Age kind of your evolving relationship with the Fantastic Four. I will say, the next time you see the Silver Surfer is probably another one of my favorite Fantastic Four stories.
Wow.
And I'm sure it's included on the reading list because it's a classic.
Well, now that we're into two-part episodes, somewhere in like 4 to 6 months, whenever I come back to the master class, I may be like this old grizzled vet who's like, I've seen some shit now.
I love it. So to switch over to the other part of 1966, Part 1.
Yes.
Which you mentioned, this is your wheelhouse.
Yes, it is.
And that's Amazing Spider-Man. And we have some big stuff happening in Amazing Spider-Man. We have a huge transition creatively. We see the end of one artist's legendary tenure and the beginning of another. And it starts with, number one, the introduction. We talked about the graduation of Peter Parker from high school last issue.
Uh-huh.
We see his introduction to college here, entering Empire State University, meeting Gwen Stacy for the first time, meeting Harry Osborn for the first time, meeting Flash Thompson again, because he sticks around. But we get to see all this new stuff in Peter Parker's life, and we also see, in many ways, the ultimate... If Galactus is the ultimate Fantastic Four story that Stan and Jack have done to this point, this trilogy that proves to be Steve Ditko's finale on Amazing Spider-Man, it's kind of his version of the Galactus story. And what I mean by that, and what I think is cool about Spider-Man and what was happening here, is that Spider-Man, you don't need to threaten the entire world like you did with Galactus to raise the stakes in Spider-Man. You just have to threaten his world, which in this case is Aunt May. And as much as she might be decried by some people as a plot device, a tired thing, how can she be so old? How can she constantly be sick? All the complaints you've heard about Aunt May. The fact is that what's important is how much she means to Peter Parker. And when she's put in jeopardy in this story, and the lengths that Spider-Man has to go to, and we all know that classic Ditko art of him tossing off the impossible weight just because he cares that much about this woman who has raised him. He's not going to let her down the same way he let Uncle Ben down. It is his ultimate hero moment. And it almost feels like the perfect way to say goodbye to Ditko, because even though Spider-Man graduated high school in the previous arc, it kind of feels like he really matures to a new level in this arc.
Well, he kind of has to, because as I pointed out on Marvel Age, this felt like they graduated the writing along with Peter from high school, if that isn't too much of a mixing of metaphors. But I felt like this was strong style storytelling, if you will, where they realized they had to up the stakes. Because, I mean, high school drama is one thing. Peter's, on again, off again, like romantic relationships. But now he's getting closer to the quote-unquote real world, where he's going to have things like paying bills and dealing with essentially an aging parent. And all this on top of trying to maintain a class schedule at a major university, though fictional, of course, and on top of that, trying to deal with all these romantic relationships out on the outskirts of his purview. But when it comes down to it, we see where Peter's priorities are. Aunt May gets sick, and that is all that matters to him. But he's still Spider-Man, and he's still got supervillains to deal with. And one of his best comes back here when the master planner, which I got to tell you, nobody busted any brain cells on that one. But he's
from the people who brought you the crime master,
right?
comes the master plan.
And then Master Planner is revealed to be Doc Ock. And it's just like, what was it the pretense for? Why couldn't he have just been, why did we have to go through all this? He could have just been Doc Ock from the jump. And he was, for God's sake. So it's not like that was any real big deal. But still, the meat of the story is in how Peter is handling all the stuff with Aunt May, and then how he's dealing with the transition into college life, how he's not really making any friends.
No.
And you kind of feel for the guy because you can see it from his angle, but they can't. So, it's one of those tough situations, but it feels very true to life. And I think that's why Amazing Spider-Man always hits with me whenever we're going back through this early stuff. Even though, yeah, the dialogue feels dated and they make references like soupy sales, or for God's sake, what the hell kind of a name is Selwyn to give to your kid? Somebody actually named their kid this? And in one of the stories coming up later, but still, all that, dating your story aside, this is still kind of timeless stuff because this is the kind of thing that Peter will deal with over and over and over again, not just in Stan's run, but in all the classic Spider-Man runs to come.
Well said. And I will say about the new supporting cast, I don't think we really get much out of Gwen Stacy in these first few issues.
Not yet.
Her best is to come. She, at this point, is just she's a love interest. I think
as was pointed out, she's Liz Allen 2.0.
She's Liz Allen 2.0. I will say I think the strongest thing about her is that, one, she's interested in Peter from the start.
True.
Like, she doesn't have to come around on him. There's something about him that intrigues her. And I think the other thing is that almost instantly, and I think this lays the seeds for what she'll eventually become, is she senses that there's something tragic about Peter. She doesn't just think he's a nerd or a jerk or anything like that. She does think, he blows her off and she can't believe it and all that. But I think you see the kernel of the idea that she understands the true Peter Parker without being fully exposed and fully knowing what he's facing. If that makes sense.
It does, and I think it's also worth pointing out that these characters are being treated very genuinely as to how most of us were when we first started college. As in, we didn't really know who we were. Who we were was not fully formed.
Right, we're finding out as we go.
Yeah, we're still trying to figure it out. Just like Peter is still gradually changing. The only difference is we've been on this journey with him for some time now. So
right, exactly.
We've been able to see him go through those changes and understand that he's getting very close to, being that version of himself that we all know and love from the modern era, because he's already been through so much and had to grow up so fast. With characters like Harry Osborn and Gwen Stacy, of course they seem a little more blank slate-ish because we've only just met them. And they're also at a time in their lives whenever they don't really know who they are. So this is all a learning experience for everyone involved, including the reader, which is part of the brilliance of Amazing Spider-Man. And I really hope that the people who are reading along with this will have that level of experience, and some who are like, well, wait a minute, this isn't the Gwen and Harry that I know from, say, different movies or whatever. Like, give it a minute. Let them grow into that, and it'll mean that much more to you, and it'll understand why these characters are so endearing and enduring in the Spider-Man fandom.
Let's talk about Harry for a second.
Let's do. He's my favorite Spider.
That's cool. I didn't know that. That's something I've just learned. But hello.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, sorry. Thought I lost you for a second. All right, so whoever's editing can edit that. Let's talk about Harry for a sec. Interesting thing about Harry to me is, Gwen Stacy might initially be Liz Allen 2.0. Harry is unique because he's something we didn't really see during the high school years of Peter Parker. And that's, even though it doesn't necessarily fully happen here, the potential for Peter to have a male friend. Because in high school, pretty much every male figure in his life, outside of Uncle Ben and Robbie Robertson, was an antagonist. Flash was a bully who picked on him. J. Jonah Jameson was a tyrant who lorded over him. He didn't bond outside of, the occasional, even Johnny Storm, who was ostensibly his superhero buddy. They still clashed. They were still rivals. With Harry, you get a genuine male friend for Peter Parker. And it allows Peter, again, as you were saying, to grow as a person. Because he couldn't just remain this loner who had the only relationships in his life were romantic. We want to see him get a group of friends. Because again, to your point, college in many ways for a lot of us is where you make your true friends. It's where you discover the people who are going to stick with you for the rest of your life. And Harry, bit of a blank slate here, but does get fleshed out pretty quickly in the next story by the introduction of his father and the dynamic that they share, and basically the idea that he and Peter have in common the fact that they both in some ways have lost their fathers. Harry's is still around, but in some ways he's inaccessible to him because of their relationship. Peter, of course, has lost both his father and his father figure in Uncle Ben. So you kind of get these two boys who are growing into men and have had to do so largely without that paternal influence. And I think that links them almost immediately in some really cool ways. But I do like that they're not friends right away. I like that we're building to that the relationship has to evolve before we see the Peter and Harry dynamic that we're more used to.
And that's part of why I've always enjoyed the Peter and Harry dynamic, is because in their initial meetings, no, they weren't really friends. That part had to be built to, and it's something that most movies and TV show adaptations will gloss right over that and just go straight to them being friends,
straight to the rivalry or the friends.
They go straight to the.
I would argue that they make them friends quickly because they want to get to the rivalry.
That's quickly. A lot of it, because they do that, and then they establish the love triangle.
Exactly,
which is something that I'm back and forth on, because sometimes I can enjoy that. I can like it for what it is. But the rivalry between Peter and Harry is so much more than just a shared love interest. These are two best friends who are pretty much always competing with each other over everything.
Yeah.
And then we get into some later stories that also involve Harry's dad and the Green Goblin. And that's really, it's not the catalyst for it. I guess it's just the final straw, honestly. And but we'll get there, because we still got to discuss the original. And yes, I can admit, though, Harry Osborn is my favorite Spider-Man villain of all time. The superior Goblin is still Norman Osborn.
Well, I would say ultimately the reason for that, Russell, and I think Harry is an intriguing Goblin because of his relationship with Peter, but this is something I've talked about before. I think the best Spider-Man villains are the adults threatening the teenager. And Norman Osborn was yet another example of that. It was almost kicked up to the next level, where if you look at the high school Spider-Man villains, the Doc Ocks, the Vultures, the Lizards, as being like the faculty, the teachers that are coming after him, Norman Osborn is a level beyond that. He is more powerful in the sense of just a presence than any of those villains. You immediately see the charisma and swagger that Norman has, and the genuine menace. And I would say, yes, he has a unique dynamic with Peter because he does learn Peter's secret identity. And that's something that none of the other Spider-Man villains have. And it does lead to some contrivances because we have to, have it so he doesn't always remember his identity. So we get the amnesia angle and some of the other stuff. But I just feel like Norman is that example of an adult who threatens Spider-Man's world and does so in a way where he can't fully be defeated and carted off to jail the way a Doc Ock or a Vulture is. Spider-Man never really gets to fully beat the Goblin. The Goblin always has an out. And he's always out there and he's always a threat. And I love the fact that, just how we were saying, Galactus kind of looms over the Fantastic Four. Once we find the Goblin's identity and know that he's Norman Osborn, and furthermore that he discovers Peter Parker's identity, even if he forgets at the end of the story, we have that looming sense of menace over Spider-Man as well. No matter what Peter's doing, no matter who Spider-Man's fighting that month, there's always the threat that the Green Goblin could come back, remember who he is, and threaten Peter in a way that no other villain really can, because he can strike out at his loved ones, which is what Peter is most afraid of. Fantastic Four don't have that worry. They're public superheroes. Everyone knows their identities. But Peter Parker has guarded his secret identity to keep people like Aunt May safe, and the Green Goblin, who we've said didn't really hit in his initial stories in previous years, hits in a big way here. And I would argue that, you know, the split in ideology between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, which ultimately was broken by the fact that Stan wanted Norman to be the Goblin and Steve wanted it to be some random person who Peter never met. I think history has proven Stan right on this one.
Yeah, Stan made the right call here. It's like, no disrespect, Steve, like a great artwork throughout, and his plots have been tremendous as well. But when it came to the Goblin reveal, this was the way to go.
Yeah, definitely.
Norman is just the perfect identity for the Green Goblin, and on top of that, in his appearance here, as rendered by the also legendary John Romita.
Yep, we're gonna get there in a sec.
We get basketball hair.
Yes, that was You know what? I resisted. I saved it for you. You could almost call it a gift that I gave you.
Okay.
Because I was gonna say that's my tagline on the show. I was going to say, when I talked about Harry, and I said, you know, he's unique in the sense we didn't have him in the initial cast. There was no male friend of Peter Parker. I was going to say he's unique in that only him and his dad have that freaky hair. That
is just it's the trippiest damn thing. Like, I don't know who came up with the idea, but it's as iconic an appearance of any character in the Marvel U. I mean, I see that basketball hair. That's an Osborn.
Yep. And anytime you see them without it, it feels wrong.
It is
like, it feels
weird.
Like, who is this?
It's like, that doesn't really work. I was like,
no, exactly. You need, if you're going to have an Osborn, you need to have the basketball hair. That may be the greatest weakness of the cinematic Osborns.
It's impossible to create it. I mean, I know Greg has been calling for it for a long time now, but
yeah,
man, I don't know how you render that in live action and make it look not goofy.
I think you got to use CGI.
You'd have to animate the hair, and
you may have create the hair separately from the human.
Just don't use the same company that tried to remove Henry Cavill's mustache.
Oh boy. So yeah, Green Goblin finally takes his place as the premier villain of Spider-Man here. Some people will say Doc Ock. They're wrong. Green Goblin. Green Goblin is.
Well, in fairness, up to now, Doc Ock would have been it.
He would have been, but I think Stan, at the least, always intended for Goblin to be the main Spider-Man antagonist.
Yeah.
And
after
I think he
this,
takes
yes.
his place here. Yeah, after this, there's no question. He's got the ties to Peter. He can threaten him. He's got an interesting secret identity, and we genuinely care. In the same way, I mean, look, all due respect to Doc Ock, and I love Doc Ock, but we always say what sets apart Doctor Doom as a Fantastic Four villain is his ties to the Fantastic Four, that he feels like a member of the cast, but kind of like the black sheep uncle that no one talks about. In the same way, Green Goblin is a member of the Spider-Man extended family, and there's so many great Goblin stories to come. And I will say again, it sucks that they always have to find a way to make Norman forget Peter's identity just so they can keep going. But once they really get rolling with it, he's the best. Kraven is my personal favorite Spider-Man villain, just for reasons.
Sure.
But Green Goblin, I would never deny that he's the archenemy of Spider-Man.
Well, that's same position I have when it comes to the Green Goblin too. When it comes to Harry,
Yep.
He's my personal favorite, but I could never deny that the original Green Goblin is the ultimate arch nemesis of Peter Parker.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
That's indisputable fact. And this story, I feel like, really illustrated that. And illustrated that beautifully by man. How did he get two legendary creators right back to back?
It's a perfect way to segue into our kind of final topic for the evening, and that is the artistic transition from Steve Ditko to John Romita. And you're right, Russell, in that he gets two titans of comic book art, two legends, two of the very best to ever do it, back to back. And it's incredible because something you guys have talked about on Marvel Age and that I've talked about here is that over Ditko's tenure as the artist of Spider-Man, you can't picture anyone else drawing Spider-Man on a regular basis. If Kirby had drawn Spider-Man, I don't know that it becomes the success it did with Ditko drawing it. I think there was something about Steve's style. It was very human. It was very flawed, and it was very real, that worked for Peter Parker the high school years. The fact that Peter always looked a little out of place. The fact that his villains were just grotesque. I think once John Romita steps in, initially there's a bit of a getting to know you period where he is aping Ditko a little. But I think in much the way Peter Parker graduated high school and we kind of see the boy go away, John Romita very much draws him as a man, as an adult. And I think you start seeing little things like the girls become more attractive. The villains become less grotesque and more genuinely threatening in terms of physical size. You'd see him really bring Peter Parker to kind of that next level you were talking about. The fact that he transitions from high school to college and he immediately gets this new artist, this new look, and it's distinct. And we will see Romita kind of grow into himself and really make Spider-Man his own in the next few years. But I think you see it. You see, even on the cover with Spider-Man standing over the Green Goblin, suddenly Spider-Man is not this spindly, kind of awkward creature. He is this triumphant hero. And that's kind of the story that Stan and John are going to tell over the next few years, is Peter Parker growing up and embracing his role as Peter and as Spider-Man.
Well, it's hard to argue with any of that, but I also I like the way that he draws Peter out of costume in a way that kind of makes it feel a little distinct from what Ditko had been doing, because Ditko always
very much so.
Ditko always drew Peter a lot like himself.
Yep.
Yeah, he's very skinny. He's kind of gangly a little bit, very meek in appearance. John Romita draws Peter with a little bit more definition, a little bit more chiseled looking, like you could imagine him being like really cut if he weren't wearing clothes that were obviously trying to hide it. So,
right, exactly.
But that's the first major transition from Ditko to Romita that really stuck out in this issue. I also like the way that Romita draws faces a little bit better than the way Ditko did. I mean, Ditko's style is what it is, and it's really great, but Romita has it over him immediately in character design and in like facial expressions.
Yeah. And we'll continue to compare the two. Obviously, there's a big comparison. But I think you'll see Romita make the comic his own very quickly. Much more quickly than I would have imagined, too, given how much of a trademark Ditko left on it.
Oh, very much so. And Romita, while he is like the iconic Spider-Man artist, his run speaks for itself. I'm a Sal Buscema guy myself.
I love me some Sal Buscema. I love both the Buscema brothers, as well as John's granddaughter, Stephanie Buscema, who illustrated my only written work for Marvel, the one-page Werewolf by Night comedy strip, Werewolf by Eve, a Christmas-themed Werewolf by Night story that appeared in a Marvel Christmas special about a decade ago.
Which you can find on the Webby award-winning Marvel Unlimited streaming service. You
can. It is available. Even though after that holiday special, I was told by no less than Joe Quesada to never write anything again. You cannot deny the fact that that is on Marvel Unlimited, preserved for generations to come.
Did he come to you and say, "Kid, love you, but you're just not a comic writer"?
Didn't say love you. Didn't say love you.
He just skipped right to the part where he's just like, "Look, he's like, look, kid, you suck." I'm sorry.
Joe Q did not mince words. No, he's a great guy, and many fond memories with him. Even him telling me never to write again was good. It wasn't because it was bad. It was just he felt I had other things to contribute to the company.
He gave you a don't quit.
It was not my writing.
It was a don't quit your day job kind of moment.
Absolutely. So Russell, we've reached the end of our exploration of part 1 of 1966. Of course, you're going to be back for part 2.
Of course.
Of 1966. You're going to tackle that over on Marvel Age. You guys got a lot of cool stuff to get into. But man, this was one of my favorite episodes. I love talking about this stuff. I'm so glad that you finally found your niche on Fantastic Four. And I'm really I like that we got to I like that you were on to talk about the Spider-Man transition, because I feel like you really know this stuff and it's kind of near and dear to you.
It is, and I was happy to be here again, and we'll be happy to be back for part 2 in a couple weeks.
Now, where else can people find you in the digital world, Russell? And we do have that ad playing by now.
Yeah.
I don't know if it plays on my show because I don't do an ad break, but I'm going to say to whoever's editing this, please put the ad for Russell's new show after we get done talking here.
I do believe that it will play as maybe the last thing that people hear.
That's what I would like.
The air.
That's my perfect world.
But you guys can find me, of course, on Twitter at Russell_Sellers. I retweet Ben all the time, and he returns in kind. So
yes, indeed.
It's a fun thing. You can also follow the Place to Be Nation Comics Twitter feed at PTBN Comics. Give that a follow. That's where you're going to find all of the Place to Be Nation comic shows being tweeted out, as well as discussions about all the crazy happenings throughout the week in the world of comics. Join the Facebook the Facebook group Place to Be Nation Comics. Ben's in there, I'm in there, along with all the other podcasters from Place to Be Nation talking comics. We love talking shop. So those are the places you can find me. And coming up, I know, Ben, you've been waiting on this. Coming up in September, I will be launching a 7-part podcast series called DC Post-Crisis Management, where I and a series of special guests will be looking at the crisis-level events from DC Comics from 1986's Crisis on Infinite Earths and going all the way through the modern day. So lots of different events to get into there. And joining me on the very first episode to talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths will be the manager, Todd Weber. So that one's going to be fun. We're going to get deep on that. And, of course, in the near future, as part of that series, Ben will also be joining me on an episode to be named later.
There you go. An exclusive right here on Marvel Age Masterclass. Yes, I will be appearing on this. Finally, we get to get away from all this Marvel talk.
Oh yeah.
Get back to DC, where it all started. You guys can find me online at the Facebook page. Like Russell said, follow PTBN Comics on Twitter. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm at Ben J. Morse. And I'm also on Instagram at BenMorse882. So check me out there as well. But Russell, let's ride off into the sunset. Like I said, Russell's ad plays after this. So he will get the final word on tonight's episode. But before you get the final word, do you want to get the semifinal word?
I had a great time being here, and I can't wait to get into it in 1966 Part 2.
Part 2.
Part 2, if you will.
That's what we say around here. Yeah.
Yes.
2. Very much so. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Hi there. Have you recently gone through a crisis? Did you find out your friends had been lying to you for years to cover up something they did? Have you discovered that one of your bitter enemies might actually be 3 people? Were you seemingly killed by a new god only to find yourself quantum leaping through time until you make it back to the present? Was your entire reality wiped out in a cosmic battle between 2 godlike beings only to be reborn, destroyed, and reborn again? Then join me, Russell Sellers, and my special guests as we help you manage your post-crisis life in DC Post-Crisis Management, a limited monthly series starting in September. We can't promise you closure, but we will try to avoid destroying your hometown and turning you into a homicidal maniac who wipes out time.
Promotional consideration paid for by the following.
Hey, pro wrestling announcer Kevin Kelly here. I want to make sure you are all subscribed to all the great feeds here at Place to Be Nation. It's really easy to do. Just head to iTunes or your preferred podcatcher app today and search and subscribe to the Place to Be Nation wrestling feed, which of course includes the full archives of the Kevin Kelly Show, the Place to Be Nation pod feed, and the Pro Wrestling Only feed. Subscribe, listen, and then rate us and leave feedback today. And be sure to give Justin your true thoughts. I mean, don't hold back. After all, he is kind of a jerk. Just listen to Scott.
Place to Be Nation's JT Rosero and Chad Campbell here. We want to let you know that we have a ton of great podcasts available to you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and PlaceToBeNation.com. We offer them to you on 2 great feeds. On the Place to Be Nation Wrestling feed, we bring you the Mothership, the Place to Be podcast, along with Main Event, Survey Says, the Monday Night Wars, and our monthly pay-per-view reaction show, as well as Jeff Learns Wrestling. In addition to these full-length shows, we also deliver special network podcasts and pod blasts on topics old and new.
Over on the Pro Wrestling Only feed, we dive deep inside the wrestling business with a stacked army of experts leading the way. The feed features potpourri shows such as This Week in Wrestling, Greetings from Allentown, Match of the Week podcast, and the Military Industrial Suplex. We also have shows that focus intently on certain topics like Through the Years, Worldcast, Strong Style History, Strong Style Story, and Mount Olympus. Plus, the feed has the full archives of legendary shows like Titans of Wrestling, Where the Big Boys Play, Letters from Center Stage, and Letters from Kayfabe, plus much more. And on our very popular Place to Be Nation Pop podcast feed, we offer such great shows as Talkin' Pop, the Glenn Butler Podcast Hour Spectacular, NBA Team, PTBN Play, Sunday Groove, Breaking Balls, and Lucha Undead,
as well as a veritable podcast heaven for comics fans.
With the hard-traveling fanboys, Sellers Points, Todd Weber's Conversations, Geek and Sassy, and Marvel Age Podcast.
You can find all of these current shows, plus archives of our past podcasts, including The Kevin Kelly Show, as well by subscribing to both feeds on iTunes. And while there, be sure to rate and leave feedback today. All these shows, plus others, available at PlayStation.com, where we cover pro wrestling, sports, movies, comics, plus in-depth stretch projects, and more. Be sure to support our site by using PlayStation.com/Amazon when doing your online shopping, and download our free PTB Vintage Vault Refresh ebooks via the links on our site. We also want to thank our friends at Boneheads Wing Bar in West Warwick, Rhode Island, and Fall River, Massachusetts, and thehistoryofwrestling.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr as well. PlayStation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.